Today we're going to be speaking with Erika Engelhaupt, who's a science journalist living in Washington, D.C., and also author of the book Gory Details: Adventures from the Dark Side of Science. Erika, really great having you on. I appreciate it.
Thanks. Nice to be here.
So, we've spoken over time about everything from, homeopathy to drinking silver, faith healing, old sorts of medical treatments that maybe kind of worked at one point, but there are now better options compared to out and out scams, etc. One of the things you talk about in the book is the relation between medical myths, misconceptions, and irrational health fears, and this sense of disgust that as humans we could say has been developed or has been bred in, or however you sort of want to say it. Let's maybe start there. Talk a little bit about the tendency towards disgust and how it might predispose people to some of these medical misconceptions.
Yeah, I think, disgust is one of those kind of overlooked emotions, something that we don't necessarily think about or talk about a lot. Um, but some psychologists would say that it's one of the basic human emotions. It seems to be universal, at least the feeling of disgust. Um, there are certain particular signs of disgust that people around the world give, that kind of squinched up face, um, you know, kind of expelling something out of your body, like, you stick
Yeah,
your
like
tongue out.
80% of the way to gagging, we might say. Yeah.
Exactly, exactly. And that's something that, people around the world experience that feeling of disgust. But in terms of what things are considered disgusting, that's really kind of up for grabs culturally. So that is something that we tend to learn as we grow up. So there may be something where humans as a species have evolved the sense of disgust, probably as a protective mechanism, because a lot of the things that disgust us are things that could hurt us, right? Things that could make us sick, for example. So, we learn, we teach most of our children around the world, not to eat their poop. And, maybe as babies, they're not disgusted by poop and they'll stick their hands right in it. But we teach our kids to be disgusted by the smell and appearance of poop. And most of us around the world get that at some point in our lives. But there are a lot of other things that vary from place to place, culture to culture, especially when it comes to things like food. So every culture has some food that it thinks is delicious and that other cultures think is totally disgusting.
Yes.
So it's relative. So there are things that are pretty universally disgusting. Those tend to be the things that could hurt us or make us sick. And then there are other things that are just, we decide basically that something is disgusting and something is not disgusting.
And so then
Um,
what's the connection from that to the medical myths and misconceptions?
yeah. So disgust is a really powerful feeling. And so since we have this, strong aversion to certain things, um, that means that it can really kind of guide our decisions and shape our thinking about things. And a lot of the things that we're disgusted by um, involve our bodies. A lot of things involving bodily functions. Um, all of our bodily secretions and excretions, blood, sweat, tears, snot. These are things that you don't necessarily, they're very intimate and they're generally considered disgusting if they're coming from a stranger, right?
Sure.
So we're not necessarily disgusted so much by our own body fluids and so forth, but we're certainly disgusted by those of strangers. And so when you think about, some of the different kinds of um, medical treatments and products, things that people are trying to sell to us, it's very easy to play into that sense of disgust. For example, there's a huge industry built around the idea of detoxifying our bodies,
Yes.
purifying, cleansing. All of these things are basically meant to make us less disgusting. We all want to be less disgusting, right? We all want to have this idea of being, clean and pure. Um, but when it comes down to it, a lot of these things are playing on our disgust of our bodies or other people's bodies, um, and really are not selling us something that's real. Again, it's easy to play on that disgust and say like, oh, this is going to detoxify you.
Yeah.
Um, and that sounds good. And if we see, for example, if there are certain kinds of sweat therapy that people are selling really hard, and the idea is that you can sweat out the toxins. And if people see something coming out of their bodies, it feels like satisfying. It feels like
Right.
you're getting something bad out.
Yeah,
And you
I've
feel
told stories of, I don't do it often because I find it painfully awkward, but I've had like professional massages before, and the
Mhm.
massage goes great. And at the end, they say, the massage will loosen a lot of the toxins in the body, so you should drink a lot of water. And I'm thinking, wait a second. So the water is processed in the kidney. What's the
Right.
mechanism here that's going on? But it's sort of that same idea where it's just like, it sounds generally good. Yeah. Like, I mean, I
Right.
could kind of go for that. Jonathan Haidt has written about the connections between disgust and political leanings and predispositions.
Yes. Mhm.
And I'm wondering whether when it comes to medical myths, misconceptions, quack cures, and openness and this sort of thing, whether there are other maybe personality traits or whatever that we may be able to overlay on, whether it's politics or
Yeah.
upbringing or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, definitely people, there's a range in how easily disgusted people are. Some people are very sensitive to disgust and are very easily triggered to feel disgusted. Others, not so much. Seem to have a pretty high tolerance for disgust, for example, because I write about gross things.
Yes.
Um, but a lot of people don't. And there have been some studies, like what you're referencing, that link those traits, how easily disgusted you are, to various other kinds of opinions that we form. And so, in general, and I don't want to make this any kind of hard and fast rule, but some studies have found a connection between people who are more easily disgusted and people who tend to be more conservative political leaning.
Yes.
And it kind of makes sense if you think about the idea of, that a person who is very easily triggered to feel disgust might be kind of sensitive and afraid of things that could cause that feeling. And so things that are different, things that are outside, may be more triggering to some people than to others. I think the same kind of thing happens, perhaps with these kinds of health beliefs and misconceptions. Some people seem to be just more sensitive and more triggered by the idea of being contaminated by something, by things that are dirty, and that can also be likewise that can be played back into politically.
One of the
One of the
interesting things
things.
about this that you're making me think of is, there's a lot of, I think we can all understand how, if indeed this higher sense of, or this more easily triggered disgust aligns with political conservatism, we could see how that might make people against immigration, right? We hear stories
Right.
about, Tucker Carlson once overtly said, immigrants make the country dirtier and poorer. That's literally something that you would be disgusted by, the dirt that he said. Okay, that one's super clear. It's been interesting to see with the pandemic. You
Yeah.
would think germs around me. You would think that with a more easily triggered disgust response, the right would have been more sensitive to the idea of the germs of COVID. But for political reasons and for other reasons, it hasn't actually been the case.
Right. Yeah, I think that's an interesting point too. But disgust can cut a lot of different ways, and we have to remember that disgust can also be weaponized.
Right.
It can be turned against certain groups of people. Like you were saying, it's often turned against immigrants, saying, oh, they're diseased and dirty, and they're coming in here and they're contaminating our population in some way.
Yes.
The same kind of thing can happen with COVID, where there's, marginalizing of certain groups because they're seen as the cause So we saw that with Asian Americans earlier in the pandemic and so forth. And so, I think that the disgust can be weaponized in whatever way is convenient for particular, you know, political groups' interests. So sometimes you get things that are sort of nonsensical, where it seems like people are really acting against their own best interests.
Yeah, or even their predispositions. But interestingly, there was a sense of disgust about the masks by some of the folks who did not see, the feeling of the mask and it's restricting my breathing and I'm rebreathing my own carbon dioxide. Related to this, does one's willingness to accept a medical myth treatment, scam treatment, or whatever the case may be, relate to how disgusted or put off they are by whatever it is they are trying to treat, if that makes sense? In other words, when you maybe learn more about something, you would be less likely to fall for the misinformation and the quack cures.
I think that's probably true, and I don't think that we have necessarily hard data to demonstrate that, but it's pretty logical. And I will cite an example of kind of a more extreme version.
Yeah.
So, for example, people who are already easily sensitized or disgusted by insects and afraid of, the people. Some of us are totally freaked out by insects or spiders. Some of us, not so much. There's a condition called delusions of infestation that I have worked on for several years now, and it's really upsetting. It's where people develop the idea that insects or other small creatures have literally infested their bodies.
Right.
And it often starts with something real, like an itch. It could be as simple as a skin condition that's causing an itch. But because some people are already kind of worried about insects or just sort of more prone to feel disgust about insects, if they happen to see an insect in the environment, they may make the connection that, oh, I think that's what's going on here. I think that I've got these insects attacking me.
Right.
And so I think that's kind of an extreme example of where someone who maybe is already kind of predisposed to a certain kind of disgust or feeling about insects, may be more likely to develop this extreme delusion, which can be completely devastating, where it takes over people's lives and, their lives really become about trying to prove to everyone else that this infestation is real.
Yeah, my dad's a psychiatrist, and he's dealt with that and talked to me about it. Sometimes that does respond quite well to medication, interestingly enough. Now, the interesting thing is that relates to something else I've said before, which is, we've talked a lot about conspiracy theories on the show.
Yeah.
And we'll sometimes say, how does someone fall into, is it flat Earth, or is it, more recently with relation to COVID, stuff about vaccines? How is it they end up with that as opposed to something else? And very often it's sort of environmental and circumstantial. It's, listen, because of the media environment and the people that they're around and where they live, they're into, does injecting bleach cure COVID, as opposed to something about the Bilderbergs or flat Earth. So there's like but they are predisposed generally to this type of thinking. It seems that with some of the things you're talking about, there might also be a similar idea where it's not, I don't know. It seems that someone who falls into what you just described about the insects would be predisposed to something else if it was environmental or around them culturally.
Right, exactly. And, we have to keep in mind, too, that all of us experience some kind of what psychologists call magical thinking.
Yes.
None of us are perfectly logical beings. And so we all have these kinds of beliefs and misconceptions going on all the time.
About something.
about something. And, magical thinking, it can be, psychologists talk about the law of similarity and the law of contagion, um, which relate to disgust because, the law of similarity says the image is the object. And so that's the kind of thinking that makes, for example, burning an effigy a very powerful statement because in our minds, deep in our lizard brain somewhere, it really feels like when you burn the symbol of the person, you're harming the person. It's what makes voodoo dolls satisfying to stab. And it's also related to disgust. It's what makes poop-shaped chocolates not a big hit,
Right.
right? Because we associate the disgusting thing of poop with the chocolate, even though the chocolate is perfectly fine to eat. Um, and so, that kind of thinking can come into basically our beliefs about health and wellness and all of these things as well. And certainly I think that indicates something about our belief systems more broadly. And so certainly I think it makes sense to me that, you know, there are these kind of deeper reasons in our thinking that we're all vulnerable to, why we might be susceptible to certain myths and misconceptions, and then our environments and our society, our culture, the people that we're around, shape the details of those things.
The book is Gory Details, Adventures from the Dark Side of Science. We've been speaking with the book's author, Erika Engelhaupt, who's a journalist living in Washington, D.C. Erika, really appreciate your time and insights today.
Thank you so much. Great to be on.